The afternoon sun cast long, golden shadows across the village green of St. Mary Mead, where the annual harvest festival had drawn nearly every resident from their cottages and gardens. Miss Jane Marple sat comfortably on a wooden chair beneath the spreading branches of the old elm, her knitting needles clicking in a gentle rhythm that seemed to match the lazy hum of conversation around her. From this vantage point, she could observe the pleasant bustle of village life while appearing to be nothing more than an elderly lady enjoying the autumn warmth. The festival had been organized this year by Mrs. Lydia Ashford, the widow who had moved to St. Mary Mead just 18 months prior. She had taken residence in Willowmere House, the Georgian manor that overlooked the village from its position on the gentle rise beyond the church. The house came with extensive grounds, including what the locals had dubbed the empty garden, a walled enclosure behind the main house that had stood neglected for decades, its paths overgrown and its fountain silent. Mrs. Ashford was a woman of perhaps 55, with a kind of refined bearing that spoke of good breeding and comfortable circumstances. Her late husband, Colonel James Ashford, had left her well provided for, though village gossip suggested the marriage had been more one of convenience than passion. She moved through the festival crowd with gracious efficiency, her silver hair perfectly arranged beneath a small hat adorned with autumn leaves, accepting compliments on the organization with the practiced smile of someone accustomed to social leadership. Miss Marple's attention was drawn to the various personalities that orbited around their hostess, like planets around the sun. There was Dr. Geoffrey Hawthorne, the village physician, a man in his early 40s whose professional charm masked what Miss Marple suspected was a calculating nature. He had been particularly attentive to Mrs. Ashford since her arrival in the village, though whether his interest was romantic or financial remained a subject of considerable speculation among the local ladies. Standing near the tea tables was Mr. Richard Pemberton, Mrs. Ashford's nephew and only known relative. He was a thin, nervous young man of perhaps 30, with the pale complexion of someone who spent too much time indoors. Village gossip, which Miss Marple absorbed with the patient attention of a naturalist studying local fauna, suggested that Richard had expected to inherit his uncle's estate, and had been somewhat surprised to discover that Mrs. Ashford held a life interest in the property. More intriguing still was the presence of Mrs. Helena Fairfax, an elegant woman of Mrs. Ashford's generation who had driven over from the neighboring village of Much Benham. The two women maintained a polite cordiality that Miss Marple recognized as the kind of careful courtesy that often masked deep attentions. Mrs. Fairfax had been, according to Mrs. Bantry's whispered intelligence, Colonel Ashford's first love, a romance that had ended abruptly when the Colonel chose to marry Lydia instead. As the afternoon progressed, Mrs. Ashford announced that she would conclude the festivities with a special performance. She had, she explained to the gathered crowd, discovered something rather remarkable while exploring the neglected areas of her new home. In the empty garden behind Willowmere House, she had found an old music box with a haunting melody and had taken the liberty of composing words to accompany it. "I call it the Widow's Song," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "It seems appropriate, given my circumstances." The crowd followed her in a cheerful procession up the winding path that led to Willowmere House. Miss Marple, despite her age, kept pace with the group, her sharp eyes taking in the layout of the grounds. The main garden was well maintained, with late roses still blooming along the terraces, but beyond it lay the high brick wall that enclosed the mysterious empty garden. The entrance to the walled garden was through a wooden door set into an archway overgrown with ivy. As Mrs. Ashford produced an ornate iron key and unlocked the door, she explained that this had once been the pride of Willowmere House, a formal garden with geometric beds, a central fountain, and a small pavilion where the Victorian owners had entertained their guests. What they found beyond the door was indeed a place of faded grandeur. The geometric beds were now wild tangles of overgrown shrubs and volunteer trees. The fountain stood dry and cracked, its basin filled with fallen leaves. Ivy had claimed most of the pavilion, though its basic structure remained sound. Yet there was something hauntingly beautiful about the decay, as if nature had created its own artwork from the ruins of human ambition. Mrs. Ashford led them to the center of the garden, where she had placed a small table with the music box she had mentioned. It was an exquisite piece, clearly antique, with mother-of-pearl inlay and delicate brass fittings. As she wound the mechanism, a melancholy melody began to play, its notes echoing strangely in the enclosed space. Then Mrs. Ashford began to sing. Her voice was untrained but pleasant, and the words she had composed spoke of loss and loneliness, of gardens that bloomed unseen and songs that echoed in empty spaces. The effect in that overgrown, forgotten place was genuinely moving. Even Miss Marple, who had heard many performances over the years, found herself touched by the combination of melody, setting, and the widow's obvious emotion. It was as the song reached its final verse that something went wrong. Mrs. Ashford's voice, which had been growing stronger and more confident, suddenly wavered. She reached out as if to steady herself against the table, but her hand seemed to lose its strength. The music box continued its tinkling melody as she swayed, her face growing, pale, her eyes wide with what looked like surprise rather than pain. Dr. Hawthorne was moving before anyone else realized the severity of the situation. He reached Mrs. Ashford just as her knees buckled, catching her as she fell. But even as he lowered her gently to the moss-covered stones of the old garden path, Miss Marple could see from his expression that his medical intervention had come too late. "I'm afraid," Dr. Hawthorne said quietly, his voice cutting through the sudden silence, "that Mrs. Ashford is dead." The music box continued to play its haunting melody for several more seconds before the mechanism wound down, leaving the empty garden in a silence that seemed to press against the ivy-covered walls. Miss Marple remained perfectly still, her knitting forgotten in her lap, but her mind was already beginning to work with the methodical precision that had served her well in previous encounters with sudden death. She had noticed in those final moments of Mrs. Ashford's performance several small details that others might have missed. The way Richard Pemberton had moved closer to the pavilion, positioning himself behind a screen of overgrown laurel. The manner in which Dr. Hawthorne had checked his pocket watch just before Mrs. Ashford began her final verse. The fact that Mrs. Helena Fairfax had been standing near the old fountain, her gloved hand resting on its crumbling rim, her attention focused not on the performance but on something else entirely. Most intriguingly of all, Miss Marple had observed that the music box, which Mrs. Ashford claimed to have discovered in the empty garden, bore a small brass nameplate that was clearly visible when the afternoon sun struck it at the proper angle. The inscription read, "To Helena, with all my love, James." As the first shocked exclamations began to rise from the assembled villagers, Miss Marple sat quietly in the gathering shadows of the empty garden, her fingers automatically resuming their knitting while her mind began to sort through the threads of what she suspected would prove to be a most complex and carefully planned murder. The widow's song had ended, but Miss Marple had the distinct feeling that the real performance was only just beginning. The little procession that had filed so cheerfully into the walled garden now dispersed in confused, hushed clusters, their festive mood utterly transformed. Miss Marple observed the immediate aftermath with the same quiet attention she might give to studying the behavior of birds disturbed from their roost, each person's reaction revealing something essential about their nature and their relationship to the deceased. The crowd's initial response was a mixture of shock, morbid curiosity, and that peculiar excitement that sudden death brings to otherwise ordinary lives. Mrs. Bantry, her cheeks flushed with the drama of it all, immediately began organizing the removal of the more susceptible ladies with the efficiency of a seasoned general. The vicar muttered something about calling the proper authorities while fumbling for his church keys as if they might somehow unlock this terrible puzzle. Children who had been laughing and chasing through the overgrown shrubs now clung to their parents' skirts, their eyes wide with the kind of bewilderment that comes when the adult world suddenly reveals its darker mysteries. Richard Pemberton remained frozen beside the laurel hedge where he had positioned himself during his aunt's performance. His face had gone quite pale, and Miss Marple noticed that while his voice remained steady as he insisted to anyone who would listen that Aunt Lydia had no enemies, none at all, it must have been her heart. His hands betrayed him with a slight but persistent tremor. When he thought no one was watching, she observed him glance repeatedly toward the music box, as if it held some significance beyond its role in his aunt's final song. Dr. Hawthorne had immediately assumed the professional demeanor that medical men adopt in crisis situations. He knelt beside Mrs. Ashford's still form, going through the practiced motions of checking for pulse and respiration, though Miss Marple suspected he had known from the moment he caught the falling woman that his efforts would be futile. What struck her as particularly interesting was how he seemed to be performing these actions as much for the benefit of the observers as from any real hope of revival. "Everyone please step back," he called with quiet authority. "Nothing must be disturbed until the proper authorities arrive." His voice carried the kind of calm efficiency that comes from years of dealing with medical emergencies, yet Miss Marple noted something almost too perfect about his composure. Mrs. Helena Fairfax had moved away from the fountain and now stood with one gloved hand pressed to her throat, her face nearly as pale as the deceased woman's. She appeared genuinely shocked, but Miss Marple observed that her eyes kept returning not to Mrs. Ashford's body, but to the music box that still sat on the small table, its mother-of-pearl surface catching the late afternoon light. There was a peculiar stillness about her, a controlled quality that suggested someone working very hard to maintain their composure. The arrival of Constable Higgins, followed shortly by Inspector Craddock from the county town, brought a semblance of official order to the chaos. Inspector Craddock, a methodical man with little patience for village dramatics but considerable respect for proper procedure, immediately secured the scene and began the delicate process of separating witnesses from spectators. As the crowd was gently but firmly ushered from the empty garden, Miss Marple found herself walking alongside Mrs. Bantry, who had already begun the process of constructing theories. "Poor Lydia," Mrs. Bantry whispered urgently. "Such a shock, wasn't it? She seemed so well just moments before. It must have been her heart, all that excitement about the performance and then singing in this damp air. Though I must say, that music box was rather curious, wasn't it? The inscription, I mean. Helena, of all people." Miss Marple made a small, non-committal sound that encouraged further confidences. As they passed through the ivy-covered archway, she found herself thinking of something that had caught her attention during those final, tragic moments. Mrs. Ashford had mentioned taking a lozenge for her throat before the performance. She had seen the widow slip something into her mouth just before beginning her song. It reminded Miss Marple of a young woman she had known years ago, a girl with a lovely voice who had been very particular about the throat lozenges she took before performing. That girl had come to a rather unfortunate end, though in quite different circumstances. The theories began to proliferate almost immediately among the dispersing crowd. Heart failure was the most popular explanation. It was natural, it was sudden, and it required no uncomfortable questions about motives or enemies. But Miss Marple had noticed several small details that the others had missed, the way Dr. Hawthorne had checked his pocket watch just before Mrs. Ashford began her final verse, the manner in which Richard had positioned himself behind the screen of laurel where he could observe without being easily observed himself, and most significantly, the fact that Mrs. Fairfax had been handling something near the old fountain just moments before the performance began. As the police began their preliminary interviews and the body was prepared for removal, Miss Marple made her way slowly back toward the village. The empty garden would soon be sealed and examined, but she suspected that its real secrets lay not in the overgrown paths and crumbling fountain, but in the carefully maintained facades of the three people who had been closest to Lydia Ashford in her final moments. The widow's song had indeed ended, but Miss Marple had the distinct impression that the real performance, the one involving alibis, motives, and carefully concealed truths, was only just beginning. She thought again of that young woman from long ago and her particular fondness for barley sugar lozenges, and wondered whether some patterns of human behavior were as persistent as the ivy that had claimed the walls of Willowmere's forgotten garden. The morning after Mrs. Ashford's shocking death brought with it the peculiar atmosphere that settles over a village when tragedy has visited. Conversations were conducted in hushed tones, and even the most mundane activities seemed to carry an air of solemnity. At the post office, Mrs. Bantry held court with the authority of someone who had witnessed the entire drama firsthand, while the baker's wife listened with the rapt attention usually reserved for Sunday sermons. It was her heart. Naturally, Mrs. Bantry declared with the confidence of someone who had consulted Dr. Hawthorne himself. The poor dear simply overtaxed herself with all the excitement of the performance. At her age, one must be careful about such emotional strain. She lowered her voice conspiratorially. Though I must say that music box was rather provocative, wasn't it? The inscription, I mean. To Helena, with all my love, James. Imagine Mrs. Fairfax's feelings, having that particular ghost from the past thrust before her so publicly. Miss Marple, who had arrived at the post office on the pretext of purchasing stamps, listened to these theories with the patient attention of someone gathering wool for a particularly complex pattern. The village's collective wisdom, she had long observed, often contained threads of truth woven together with speculation and wishful thinking. The art lay in separating one from the other. Inspector Craddock's arrival at her cottage that afternoon provided an opportunity for more systematic reflection. He accepted her offer of tea with the weary gratitude of a man who had spent the morning interviewing witnesses whose memories seemed to shift like sand with each telling. "The preliminary examination suggests heart failure," he began, settling into the familiar chintz chair. "Dr. Hawthorne believes it was quite sudden, possibly brought on by the excitement of the performance. Mrs. Ashford was, after all, not a young woman, and the emotional strain may have been more than her system could bear." Miss Marple poured the tea with steady hands, her expression thoughtfully neutral. "How very convenient for everyone concerned," she murmured, so quietly that Inspector Craddock had to lean forward to catch her words. "I mean, how fortunate that Dr. Hawthorne was present to provide immediate medical attention, though I suppose it made little difference in the end. Dr. Hawthorne has been most cooperative with our preliminary assessment," Inspector Craddock replied, though something in Miss Marple's tone made him consult his notebook with renewed attention. "Though I must admit, there are several small details that puzzle me. The music box, for instance. Mrs. Ashford claimed to have discovered it in the empty garden, yet it shows no signs of weathering. The mechanism works perfectly, and the mother-of-pearl inlay is pristine, hardly what one would expect from something abandoned in a damp garden for years." Miss Marple nodded slowly, her knitting needles resuming their gentle rhythm. "And then there's the matter of Dr. Hawthorne's remarkable familiarity with the garden's layout. For someone who claimed never to have visited the walled enclosure before yesterday's performance, he navigated those overgrown paths with surprising confidence. He stepped around that fallen branch near the pavilion without even glancing down, rather like someone who had encountered that particular obstacle before." Inspector Craddock's pen paused over his notebook. "That is most interesting. Dr. Hawthorne specifically mentioned that yesterday was his first visit inside the walled garden." "Oh, I'm quite sure he said that," Miss Marple agreed with gentle emphasis. "Though actions often speak more clearly than words, don't you think? And speaking of actions, I couldn't help but notice Mrs. Helena Fairfax's particular care with her gloves yesterday. White kid leather, very fine quality, and she kept them on throughout the entire afternoon, even in the warm weather." You think she was concealing something? I think she was being very careful not to touch anything directly, Miss Marple replied, diplomatically. Even when she steadied herself against the old fountain, she used only her gloved hand. It reminded me of a young woman I once knew who had been handling certain substances that left rather distinctive stains on the fingers. She wore gloves for weeks afterward, claiming it was for her complexion, but of course it was really to hide the evidence of her amateur experiments in chemistry. The word chemistry hung in the air between them like a question mark. Inspector Craddock made several rapid notes before looking up with the expression of a man who was beginning to see familiar patterns in what had initially appeared to be a straightforward case. "There's something else," Miss Marple continued, setting down her teacup with deliberate care. Mrs. Ashford was quite particular about taking a throat lozenge before her performance yesterday. I noticed she had rather specific preferences about such things. Not the common barley sugar that most people favor, but something with a distinctive medicinal quality. Sometimes the smallest details prove to be the most significant, don't you think? As Inspector Craddock prepared to leave, his notebook considerably fuller than when he had arrived, Miss Marple offered one final observation. "You might also find it worthwhile to inquire about young Richard Pemberton's movements before the performance began. He seemed quite anxious to position himself behind that screen of laurel, ostensibly to avoid disturbing his aunt's presentation, though one might wonder if there were other considerations involved. Such as the fact that from that particular position, a quick-thinking person could reach the small table where the music box sat without being observed by the audience," Miss Marple said gently. "Not that I'm suggesting anything improper, of course, but nervous young men who have recently discovered they are sole heirs to considerable properties sometimes behave in ways that invite speculation." Inspector Craddock paused at the garden gate, struck by the cumulative weight of Miss Marple's observations. "You suspect this wasn't a natural death?" "I suspect," Miss Marple said with characteristic understatement, "that Mrs. Ashford's widow's song may have been orchestrated by someone other than herself, though, of course, that's merely the fancy of an old woman who has perhaps read too many mystery novels." As the inspector's footsteps faded down the lane, Miss Marple returned to her knitting with the satisfied air of someone who had planted seeds in fertile ground. The official investigation would now proceed with proper attention to the details that mattered, while she continued her own quiet observations of human nature in all its complexity. The empty garden might hold its secrets for now, but Miss Marple had learned long ago that gardens, like people, eventually revealed what lay buried beneath their carefully tended surfaces. The widow's song had ended, but the true performance, involving alibis, motives, and carefully concealed truth, was only just beginning to reach its crescendo. The morning mist that clung to St. Mary Mead seemed heavier than usual, as if the very air had absorbed the weight of suspicion that now settled over the village. Inspector Craddock returned to Willowmere House with the methodical determination of a man who had spent a sleepless night reviewing preliminary findings that raised more questions than they answered. The initial examination had revealed enough inconsistencies to warrant a more thorough investigation, though he was careful not to alarm the household staff with premature conclusions. Mrs. Emmett, the housekeeper who had served at Willowmere for 20 years, received the inspector with the dignified resignation of someone accustomed to weathering domestic crises. Her loyalty to the Ashford family was evident in every carefully measured word, yet her natural honesty compelled her to provide information that painted an increasingly complex picture of her late mistress's final days. Madame was very particular about her throat lozenges, Mrs. Emmett explained as she led Inspector Craddock through Mrs. Ashford's private quarters. "Always insisted on Houghton and Peel's brand, said the cheaper varieties left an unpleasant aftertaste. On Friday, I sent young Ivy to the chemist, but Mr. Sykes was out of the proper sort. His assistant gave her a substitute packet, which Madame accepted with poor grace." Inspector Craddock examined the cut-glass jar on Mrs. Ashford's dressing table, noting the pale oval lozenges within. Their appearance was unremarkable, yet something about their faint medicinal scent struck him as subtly different from what he might have expected. In the wastebasket beneath the dressing table, he discovered 2 waxed paper wrappers, one bearing the Houghton and Peel crest, the other from a different manufacturer entirely. Then on Saturday morning, a parcel arrived by post, Mrs. Emmett continued, producing a neatly trimmed postal label from her apron pocket. Madame was quite pleased, said someone had been thoughtful to send her the proper lozenges. She took one just before the performance yesterday, as was her custom when speaking or singing in public. The postal label bore only a London postmark and Mrs. Ashford's name in block letters, with no return address visible. Inspector Craddock studied it with a growing conviction that this small detail might prove more significant than its modest appearance suggested. Downstairs, he found Richard Pemberton in the drawing-room, ostensibly reviewing household accounts, but clearly struggling to concentrate on the task at hand. The young man's nervous energy had crystallized overnight into a kind of exhausted anxiety that made him start at every sound. When Inspector Craddock entered, Richard immediately launched into what sounded like a rehearsed explanation. "I suppose you'll want to know about the inheritance," he said with the defensive candor of someone who had spent hours anticipating this conversation. "Yes, I inherit Willowmere and Aunt Lydia's trust fund, but there are substantial debts against the estate. I'm hardly the sort to benefit significantly from tragedy." Inspector Craddock noted the careful phrasing and the way Richard's eyes kept drifting toward the small table where the music box had sat during yesterday's fatal performance. "Where exactly were you positioned during your aunt's song, Mr. Pemberton?" "Behind the laurel hedge," Richard replied quickly. "I thought the performance was rather personal. I didn't wish to intrude by standing too close." His explanation carried the ring of truth, yet Inspector Craddock observed that from Richard's described position, any direct tampering with the music box or interference with Mrs. Ashford would have required considerable stealth and speed. Meanwhile, Miss Marple had undertaken her own quiet investigation at the village chemist's shop. Mr. Sykes, eager to be helpful, confirmed Mrs. Emmett's account, but added a detail that caught Miss Marple's immediate attention. "A gentleman came in Saturday morning, asking specifically for 2 boxes of Houghton and Peel's pastilles," Mr. Sykes explained as he arranged his stock with nervous precision. "Said Mrs. Ashford would be entertaining and he didn't want her caught short. Paid cash, he did, and was very particular about the brand." "How thoughtful of him," Miss Marple observed with gentle interest. "A local gentleman, was he?" "Well-dressed, certainly. Had the look of quality about him. Might have been a doctor, I thought at first, though something wasn't quite right about that impression. Wore gloves, which seemed odd for the weather, light-colored ones, cream or pale grey. Very careful not to touch anything directly, if you take my meaning." Miss Marple thanked Mr. Sykes and departed with her modest purchases, her mind already working to fit this new information into the pattern that was slowly emerging. A gentleman, in gloves, purchasing throat lozenges with cash, taking care not to leave fingerprints. It suggested a level of premeditation that cast Mrs. Ashford's death in an entirely different light. That afternoon, she encountered Dr. Hawthorne near the post office, where his usually composed demeanor showed signs of strain. His professional smile seemed to require more effort than usual, and she noticed that his hands, typically steady during medical consultations, showed a barely perceptible tremor as he adjusted his medical bag. "Terrible business about Mrs. Ashford," he said, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone choosing words with unusual care. "Though I suppose the police must follow their procedures, even when the medical evidence seems straightforward. Heart failure in a woman of her age. I've seen it many times in my practice." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically while observing that his assertion of medical certainty seemed to require considerable effort to maintain. "Such a shock for everyone present," she agreed. "I noticed how quickly you reached her when she collapsed. Your training must have told you immediately what was happening." "Professional instinct," Dr. Hawthorne replied, though something flickered across his features that suggested the memory was less comfortable than his words implied. "Though I must admit, I had been watching her rather carefully during the performance. She seemed overwrought. The emotional significance of that music box, the public nature of the presentation." Later that evening, as Inspector Craddock reviewed his growing collection of evidence and witness statements, he found himself drawn repeatedly to the contrast between the obvious suspect and the subtle inconsistencies that Miss Marple had begun to illuminate. Richard Pemberton certainly possessed motive and had behaved suspiciously, yet his nervous, clumsy nature seemed ill-suited to the careful planning that the lozenge substitution would have required. The mysterious gentleman at the chemist's, the untraceable postal parcel, and the careful attention to avoiding fingerprints all suggested a more sophisticated mind at work. Someone who understood both the victim's habits and the proper procedures for avoiding detection. Someone, perhaps, with medical knowledge and access to substances that could mimic natural heart failure. Miss Marple, settling into her evening routine with her knitting, reflected on the curious fact that the three people closest to Mrs. Ashford in her final moments each possessed secrets that pressed against their carefully maintained facades. Richard's gambling debts and desperate financial situation made him an obvious suspect. Yet his very obviousness suggested that the real killer might be someone far more subtle. Someone whose professional reputation and social standing provided perfect camouflage for darker intentions. The widow's song had ended, but the complex symphony of human deception was building toward what promised to be a most carefully orchestrated revelation. In her experience, the most dangerous criminals were often those who appeared most respectable, most helpful, most above suspicion. And in a case involving medical symptoms and mysterious throat lozenges, Miss Marple found her attention drawn increasingly toward those with the knowledge and opportunity to orchestrate such a precisely timed and carefully disguised murder. The morning after Mrs. Ashford's tragic death brought with it the peculiar quality of light that follows village scandal. Everything appeared sharper, more defined, as if the very air had been charged with collective curiosity and suppressed excitement. Miss Marple observed this phenomenon from her cottage window while arranging late chrysanthemums in a vase, noting how conversations ceased abruptly when participants noticed they were being observed, and how the usual patterns of village life had subtly shifted to accommodate the new reality of murder investigation. Inspector Craddock's methodical examination of Willowmere House had yielded several items of interest, though their significance remained tantalizingly unclear. Among Mrs. Ashford's personal effects, he had discovered a small correspondence file containing several recent letters, including one from Dr. Hawthorne dated Saturday morning. The note was brief but suggestive. "My dear Lydia, I believe we should discuss the matter we touched upon yesterday before you proceed with any announcements. The implications could be far-reaching. I shall call upon you this morning. G.H." Miss Marple's own investigation took a characteristically indirect approach, beginning with a condolence visit to Richard Pemberton at Willowmere House. The young man received her in the drawing room with the distracted courtesy of someone overwhelmed by sudden responsibility. The house felt different now, larger somehow, its rooms echoing with the hollow quality that accompanies unexpected inheritance. "It's all rather overwhelming," Richard confessed, gesturing toward a pile of ledgers and correspondence that covered the mahogany writing desk. Aunt Lydia was meticulous about her accounts, but there are some entries I don't understand. Large withdrawals from her personal account over the past month, substantial sums that don't correspond to any household expenses or charitable donations I can identify. Miss Marple made appropriately sympathetic sounds while her attention was drawn to the music box, now carefully preserved under a glass dome by the police. When she expressed interest in examining the piece, Richard readily agreed, grateful to discuss something other than financial irregularities and inheritance complications. As Miss Marple lifted the delicate object, her experienced fingers immediately detected what others had missed. On the highly polished underside, where it would normally rest on a surface, was a faint but distinct circular indentation, no larger than a shilling. The mark was too precise and too polished to have resulted from years of neglect in a damp garden. It spoke instead of careful placement on a specific stand or holder over an extended period. "Your aunt mentioned finding this in the empty garden," Miss Marple observed with gentle curiosity. Had she expressed any particular interest in music boxes before this discovery? Richard shook his head, his expression troubled. "Not that I recall. She said it was quite a surprise to find something so valuable just lying there among the overgrown shrubs, though now that I think about it, she seemed oddly secretive about the whole thing, almost as if she were planning some sort of surprise." Later that morning, Miss Marple encountered Dr. Hawthorne outside the post office, where his usually composed demeanor showed unmistakable signs of strain. His medical bag was clutched with unusual tightness, and she noticed that his typically steady hands showed a barely perceptible tremor as he adjusted his hat in greeting. "Such a tragic loss," he said, his professional manner intact, but requiring visible effort to maintain. "Though I must say, the police seem determined to find complexity where simple medical facts suffice. Mrs. Ashford's heart simply couldn't withstand the emotional stress of that performance." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, observing that his assertion of medical certainty seemed to require considerable energy to sustain. "You had occasion to visit her on Saturday morning, I believe. Such dedication to your patient's welfare." Something flickered across Dr. Hawthorne's features. Surprise, perhaps, or calculation. A brief consultation, nothing more. Mrs. Ashford had discovered some old family papers that had upset her considerably. She sought my advice about whether to make certain information public. The careful phrasing suggested layers of meaning that Dr. Hawthorne was reluctant to explore further. Miss Marple filed this information alongside her growing collection of observations about the complex relationships that had surrounded Mrs. Ashford in her final days. Her afternoon constitutional took her past the cottage where Mrs. Helena Fairfax was staying as a guest of her cousin. The elegant widow was tending to some late roses in the garden, her movements carrying an energy that seemed at odds with her typically controlled demeanor. Miss Marple noted with interest that Mrs. Fairfax had abandoned her customary white kid gloves in favor of ordinary cotton ones. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Fairfax called with carefully modulated warmth. "How thoughtful of you to walk this way. I was just thinking how the gardens here pale in comparison to those at Willowmere. Such extensive grounds. I remember them from years ago, when dear James was alive." The casual mention of Colonel Ashford carried undertones that Miss Marple recognized as significant. "You were familiar with the house during the Colonel's lifetime." Mrs. Fairfax's expression grew distant, touched with something that might have been bitterness. "Oh yes, quite familiar. James often entertained there before his marriage. The empty garden was his particular retreat. He kept certain treasured possessions in a small study that overlooked those walls. I remember a music box he was quite fond of, displayed on a special brass stand that kept it perfectly stable." The circular indentation Miss Marple had discovered suddenly took on new significance. How interesting that Mrs. Ashford should have found such a piece in the abandoned garden, almost as if it had been deliberately placed there. Mrs. Fairfax's carefully maintained composure showed the first signs of genuine strain. Lydia always had a talent for theatrical gestures. That performance yesterday, with the music box and her widow's song, it felt rather like a calculated provocation. As Miss Marple continued her walk, She reflected on the curious pattern that was emerging from these seemingly casual conversations. The music box had clearly not been discovered in the empty garden as Mrs. Ashford claimed, but had been deliberately placed there as part of some larger design. The question was whether that design had been Mrs. Ashford's own, perhaps as a means of confronting old grievances, or whether someone else had orchestrated its placement for darker purposes. The financial withdrawals that Richard had mentioned, Dr. Hawthorne's nervous energy and Saturday morning visit, Mrs. Fairfax's intimate knowledge of Willowmere's layout, and the music box's origins. Each thread seemed to lead back to secrets that predated Mrs. Ashford's death by decades. In Miss Marple's experience, the most dangerous murders were often those that grew from old wounds that had never properly healed. That evening, as she settled into her customary chair with her knitting, Miss Marple considered the possibility that Mrs. Ashford's final performance had been intended not as entertainment, but as revelation. The widow's song might have been designed to expose truths that someone else was desperate to keep buried. And if that were the case, then the gentle woman who had collapsed in the empty garden might have been silenced not by her weak heart, but by someone who understood that certain secrets were worth killing to protect. The empty garden had yielded one crucial clue in the form of that telltale circular indentation, but Miss Marple suspected that the most significant revelations lay not in physical evidence, but in the complex web of relationships that bound her three most likely suspects to the victim and to each other. The widow's song had ended, but the true performance, involving decades-old betrayals and carefully maintained deceptions, was only beginning to reach its crescendo. The morning brought with it the kind of persistent drizzle that seemed to press secrets from the very stones of St. Mary Mead, and with those secrets came revelations that transformed Inspector Craddock's methodical inquiry into something approaching urgent necessity. The preliminary autopsy results, delivered by special messenger from the county coroner, lay spread across Miss Marple's sitting-room table like pieces of a puzzle that was finally beginning to reveal its true pattern. Dr. Morrison's report was precise in its medical terminology, but devastating in its implications. While Mrs. Ashford had indeed suffered cardiac arrest, the examination revealed traces of digitalis in concentrations far exceeding any therapeutic dose. The poison, derived from the common foxglove plant, had been administered within hours of death and in a form that suggested deliberate concealment within some other substance. The throat lozenges, Miss Marple observed with quiet satisfaction, her knitting needles resuming their gentle rhythm. Someone with botanical knowledge would understand precisely how to extract and concentrate the active principles of foxglove. More importantly, someone familiar with Mrs. Ashford's habits would know exactly when and how she would consume such a doctored sweet. Their discussion was interrupted by young Ivy, who arrived with a basket of eggs and a tail that proved far more valuable than her modest offering. The maid's nervous energy had crystallized overnight into a need to unburden herself of observations that had been troubling her since the tragedy. "There was a gentleman caller on Friday evening," she began, her fingers working anxiously at her apron strings. "Tall, well-dressed, with pale gloves, though the weather wasn't cold. He didn't give his name to me, just asked to wait in the small study off the library. Madame kept him there no more than 10 minutes, but when he left by the side door, she was in tears." Inspector Craddock's pen moved rapidly across his notebook as Ivy continued. "And the music box, sir. It wasn't in the empty garden when I cleaned the house Thursday. It was on the shelf in the morning room where it had been since Madame's arrival. She moved it to her own bedroom Friday night after the gentleman's visit, and told me I was not to touch it, only the little table that would hold it for the performance." The implications were staggering. The music box, far from being a discovered treasure, had been deliberately placed in the empty garden as part of Mrs. Ashford's planned revelation. But what had the mysterious visitor's role been in that plan? Miss Marple's subsequent visit to the post office yielded another crucial piece of information. Mrs. Hubbard, the postmistress, recalled 2 parcels posted to London on Saturday morning, one from Mrs. Price Ridley to her dressmaker, and another with no return address, wrapped in the distinctive brown twine that Mr. Sykes sold at the chemist's shop. Whoever posted it was very particular about the wrapping, Mrs. Hubbard confided. Used a sailor's knot, neat as you please, though we've no sailors in St. Mary Mead. And he wore gloves, cream-colored ones that looked expensive. The pattern was becoming clearer with each revelation. Someone had traveled to London to post the doctored throat lozenges, using a sophisticated method to obscure their local origin. The timing suggested the package had been prepared after the Friday evening visit to Willowmere, arriving back at Mrs. Ashford's house on Saturday morning just in time for the fatal performance. Meanwhile, Mrs. Emmett's discovery of a hidden correspondence file in Mrs. Ashford's private study provided the motive that had been missing from the equation. The letters, dozens of them, revealed that Helena Fairfax and Colonel Ashford had continued their romantic relationship well into his marriage to Lydia. More damaging still, they suggested that Helena had believed herself to be the Colonel's legitimate wife, based on some earlier ceremony or promise that would have invalidated his subsequent marriage. Mrs. Ashford discovered these letters last week. Mrs. Emmett explained to Inspector Craddock with obvious reluctance. She spent hours going through old family documents, growing more agitated by the day. On Saturday morning, she announced that she intended to set certain matters straight at the Harvest Festival. The widow's song, it appeared, had been intended as more than entertainment. It was to be Mrs. Ashford's public exposure of a decades-old deception. But someone had ensured that her revelation would be her last performance. Dr. Hawthorne's behavior took on new significance in light of these discoveries. His Saturday morning visit to Mrs. Ashford, ostensibly about family papers that had upset her, now appeared in a different light. His note mentioning far-reaching implications and the need to discuss matters before any announcements suggested he had been aware of Mrs. Ashford's intentions and had attempted to dissuade her. As Miss Marple sat in her cottage that evening, her knitting forgotten in her lap, she contemplated the curious fact that each new piece of evidence seemed to point toward multiple suspects while revealing the sophisticated planning behind Mrs. Ashford's murder. The mysterious visitor in pale gloves, the carefully timed postal delivery, the strategic placement of the music box, all spoke of a mind that understood both human psychology and practical logistics. Yet something about the pattern troubled her. In her experience, the most dangerous criminals were often those who understood how to direct suspicion toward obvious targets while concealing their own involvement behind masks of professional respectability. The widow's song had ended, but Miss Marple suspected that the true performance, involving misdirection, planted evidence, and carefully orchestrated revelations, was approaching its most crucial movement. The empty garden had yielded its secrets at last, but the most important truth remained hidden behind the facades of respectability that her 3 prime suspects had spent years perfecting. Tomorrow would bring new confrontations, and Miss Marple intended to be ready for them. The grey dawn that settled over St. Mary Mead brought with it an atmosphere of barely contained tension, as if the village itself had grown weary of harboring secrets and was ready to surrender them to the relentless pressure of investigation. Miss Marple woke with the peculiar sensation that comes to those who have spent decades observing human nature. The certainty that events were approaching their inevitable climax, when carefully maintained facades would finally crack under the accumulated weight of deception and guilt. Inspector Craddock arrived at her cottage before the breakfast bell had finished ringing, his usually methodical demeanor transformed by something approaching excitement. In his hands, he carried both a telegram from Scotland Yard and the coroner's preliminary report, documents that promised to sweep away any lingering doubts about the nature of Mrs. Ashford's death. "The medical evidence is conclusive," he began, settling into the familiar chintz chair with barely concealed satisfaction. "Dr. Morrison found significant traces of digitalis in Mrs. Ashford's system, far exceeding any therapeutic dose. The poison was administered within 2 hours of death, almost certainly concealed in the throat lozenge she consumed before her performance." Miss Marple set down her teacup with careful precision, her knitting needles resuming their gentle rhythm as her mind began to process the implications. "And the source of this digitalis, Inspector?" "That's where the investigation becomes particularly interesting," Craddock replied, consulting his notebook with obvious pleasure. The London postal inquiry yielded remarkable results. The package containing the doctored throat lozenges was posted from a specialized chemist's shop in Bloomsbury, one that maintains detailed records of all purchases involving botanical preparations. The revelation that followed cast the entire case in a new and disturbing light. The purchaser had given the name Dr. Geoffrey Hawthorne, complete with a medical license number that proved upon verification to be entirely fictitious. The Bloomsbury chemist remembered the transaction distinctly, a well-dressed gentleman who had been unusually specific about the concentration of digitalis extract, claiming he required it for cardiac research. "But surely," Miss Marple observed with characteristic understatement, "Dr. Hawthorne would have been more circumspect about using any variation of his own name for such a purchase." Inspector Craddock's expression grew thoughtful as he considered this apparent contradiction. "Precisely what troubles me, Miss Marple. For someone who demonstrated such sophistication in other aspects of the crime, the timing, the delivery method, the careful avoidance of local fingerprints, it seems remarkably careless to use any form of his real identity." The subsequent interrogations, conducted in the oak-paneled privacy of the Rose and Crown's back parlor, revealed the complex web of relationships and motivations that had surrounded Mrs. Ashford in her final days. Dr. Hawthorne, when confronted with the London evidence, maintained his professional composure with visible effort, though his usual steady hands showed an unmistakable tremor as he adjusted his medical bag. "The use of my name, or some variation of it, is clearly an attempt to implicate me in this tragedy," he declared with carefully measured indignation. "Anyone familiar with my practice would know that I have legitimate access to cardiac medications, making me an obvious target for such deception. The real killer has demonstrated considerable cunning in directing suspicion toward me." Richard Pemberton's interview proved even more revealing, as the young man's nervous energy had crystallized overnight into barely controlled panic. When presented with evidence of his aunt's investigation into Colonel Ashford's past and the substantial sums she had paid to a London private detective, his carefully constructed narrative of ignorance began to crumble. "She was investigating Uncle James," he stammered, his face draining of color. "But why? What could she have hoped to discover after all these years?" His genuine bewilderment suggested that whatever Mrs. Ashford had planned to reveal, her nephew had been as surprised by it as anyone else. Mrs. Helena Fairfax's composure, when finally tested under direct questioning, proved more fragile than her elegant exterior had suggested. Confronted with the cache of letters revealing her decades-long obsession with Colonel Ashford and her delusional claims to legitimacy, her carefully maintained dignity finally cracked. "Lydia planned that performance specifically to humiliate me," she said, her voice breaking with suppressed emotion. "She intended to display James's music box, his gift to me, while singing about widowhood and loss. It was calculated cruelty, designed to expose my feelings before the entire village. But the most significant revelation emerged not from Helena's confession of wounded pride, but from her testimony as a witness. Just as Lydia began her final verse, I saw Richard emerge from behind the laurel hedge, very close to where she stood. He appeared to be fumbling with something in his pocket, and moments later, I watched her take that lozenge. Miss Marple listened to these proceedings with the patient attention of someone who understood that human motivations were rarely simple or straightforward. As Inspector Craddock compiled his evidence, she found herself increasingly troubled by the neat pattern that was emerging. Richard Pemberton, the nervous nephew with financial motives, now had a witness placing him suspiciously close to the victim at the crucial moment. "It fits almost too perfectly," she murmured to Inspector Craddock as they reviewed the day's revelations. "In my experience, when evidence arranges itself so conveniently, it often suggests that someone has been doing the arranging." The final piece of the puzzle emerged through Mrs. Bantry's network of village intelligence. Helena Fairfax, it appeared, had been receiving regular visits from Dr. Hawthorne over the past several months. Visits that she had initially described as medical consultations, but which had gradually taken on a more ominous character. "He knew about my difficulties with accepting reality," Helena admitted when pressed about these meetings. "Geoffrey offered to help me maintain my dignity, to keep my secrets safe from public scrutiny. But the price for his discretion kept growing higher, and when Lydia threatened to expose everything anyway, I realized that his protection was worthless. The blackmail network that Dr. Hawthorne had constructed was more extensive than anyone had initially suspected. Using his medical knowledge and social position, he had systematically identified and exploited the vulnerabilities of multiple villagers, creating a web of financial dependence and emotional manipulation that had made him wealthy, while keeping his victims silent. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple sat in her cottage garden, her knitting forgotten in her lap as she contemplated the intricate deception that was finally coming into focus. Dr. Hawthorne had not merely committed murder. He had orchestrated an elaborate performance designed to direct suspicion toward others while maintaining his own position above reproach. The use of his own name in London, far from being a mistake, had been a calculated move to establish himself as a victim of frame-up, rather than a perpetrator of murder. Richard's nervous behavior and obvious financial motives made him a perfect patsy, while Helena's emotional instability and documented obsession with the deceased provided additional misdirection. Most cunningly of all, Dr. Hawthorne had positioned himself as the helpful medical professional, the first to respond to Mrs. Ashford's collapse, the one who pronounced her dead and suggested natural causes. His professional authority had initially deflected any suspicion about the true nature of her death, buying him precious time to plant evidence and manipulate witnesses. The widow's song had ended, but Miss Marple now understood that the true performance, involving years of blackmail, carefully orchestrated murder, and systematic misdirection, had been conducted by someone whose medical knowledge and social respectability provided perfect camouflage for the most calculating criminal mind she had encountered in years. Tomorrow would bring the final confrontation, and she intended to be ready for it. The empty garden had yielded its secrets at last, but the most dangerous truth remained hidden behind the facade of professional respectability that Dr. Hawthorne had spent years perfecting. In Miss Marple's experience, the most dangerous criminals were often those who appeared most helpful, most above suspicion, most eager to assist in solving the very crimes they had committed. The game was approaching its endgame, and she suspected that Dr. Hawthorne's elaborate deception was about to collapse under the weight of its own complexity. The persistent drizzle that had settled over St. Mary Mead seemed to press secrets from the very stones, and with those secrets came revelations that would transform Inspector Craddock's methodical investigation into something approaching its inevitable conclusion. The morning brought news that shifted the entire foundation of their understanding, delivered in the form of laboratory reports that lay spread across Miss Marple's sitting room table like pieces of a puzzle, finally revealing its true pattern. Inspector Craddock arrived with his hat beaded with moisture and his expression bearing the weight of discoveries that had kept him awake through the night. The county laboratory has finished analyzing the throat lozenges from Mrs. Ashford's dressing table. He began without preamble, settling into the familiar chintz chair with obvious reluctance to share what he had learned. Every single one of them is perfectly ordinary, no trace of digitalis whatsoever. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused in their gentle rhythm, though her expression remained characteristically composed. "How very obliging of our murderer," she observed with quiet satisfaction, "to provide us with a false trail while simultaneously removing the evidence of their true method." The implications were staggering in their simplicity and cunning. If the fatal dose had not been in the package delivered to Willowmere House, then the digitalis had been administered separately, at the scene itself, within the crucial hour before Mrs. Ashford's collapse. Someone had placed a single poisoned lozenge where the victim would be certain to consume it, disguised among her familiar comforts. Inspector Craddock consulted his notebook with the frustrated air of a man whose careful theories had been upended overnight. Constable Higgins found Mrs. Ashford's silver reticule by the pavilion steps after the crowd dispersed. 3 ordinary lozenges inside, and this. He produced a small evidence envelope containing a twisted scrap of waxed paper, no larger than a postage stamp. Mrs. Price Ridley remembers seeing untidy paper near the music box just before the performance began. Miss Marple examined the fragment through the clear envelope, noting its medicinal scent that persisted even after exposure to the garden's dampness. The wrapper from a single poisoned sweet, placed precisely where Mrs. Ashford would find it irresistible to consume before her performance. Someone who knew her habits intimately. Someone who understood that she would never question a lozenge presented in familiar packaging on a table she had herself arranged. That afternoon, Miss Marple paid what appeared to be a casual visit to Dr. Hawthorne's surgery, ostensibly seeking advice about a minor autumnal complaint. She found him in his consulting room, his usually polished professional demeanor showing signs of strain that no amount of medical training could entirely conceal. His hands, typically steady during examinations, showed a barely perceptible tremor as he gestured toward the chair beside his desk. "Miss Marple, how may I assist you?" he inquired, though his voice carried undertones that suggested he suspected her visit had little to do with medical consultation. "Oh, merely a touch of that seasonal chill, Doctor," she replied with gentle courtesy, her gaze drifting toward the window that overlooked his meticulously maintained herb garden. "Though I confess, my real purpose in calling was to share a curious recollection that your recent difficulties brought to mind. It concerns a rather tragic case from years past, in a village not unlike our own." Dr. Hawthorne's professional mask tightened almost imperceptibly as Miss Marple began to weave her tale with the patient skill of someone who understood that truth sometimes emerged most clearly through the lens of parallel experience. There was a young physician, Dr. Henderson, who had established himself as quite indispensable to his community. Such a sympathetic listener, particularly to ladies experiencing domestic difficulties. As Miss Marple continued her seemingly innocent narrative, describing how Dr. Henderson had systematically exploited his patients' confidences while positioning himself to benefit from their misfortunes, she observed the subtle changes in her host's demeanor. His initial polite attention had transformed into rigid stillness, his eyes losing their practiced warmth and revealing something far more calculating beneath. The most remarkable aspect of the case, Miss Marple continued with gentle persistence, was how Dr. Henderson managed to direct suspicion toward his victims' own families while maintaining his reputation as a pillar of respectability. When Mrs. Pembroke died of apparent digitalis poisoning, he suggested she had harvested the fatal dose from foxgloves in her own garden during a moment of despair. Her gaze drifted meaningfully toward the flourishing foxgloves visible through Dr. Hawthorne's window, their purple bells nodding innocently in the afternoon breeze. The symbolism was unmistakable, and she observed how his eyes followed hers to the garden before returning to her face with dawning comprehension. Of course, Miss Marple added with characteristic understatement. It was never definitively proven. Dr. Henderson was far too clever for that, and his social position provided perfect camouflage for his activities. He understood that the most effective deceptions are those that appear to implicate the deceiver himself, creating the illusion of being framed while actually orchestrating every detail. Dr. Hawthorne's composed facade was cracking with each carefully chosen word, his professional training warring with the growing realization that this seemingly innocent elderly lady had penetrated the elaborate construction of his crime. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice tight with controlled tension, "I fail to see the relevance of this rather morbid historical anecdote to current circumstances." "Oh, it's not directly relevant, naturally," Miss Marple replied with gentle emphasis, her knitting needles resuming their quiet rhythm. "Except that human nature, you see, follows such remarkably consistent patterns. The cleverness, the misdirection, the way certain individuals always seem to profit from tragedy while maintaining an air of impeccable respectability. And the particular way they create scenarios where suspicion falls conveniently upon others while they themselves remain above reproach." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken understanding. Dr. Hawthorne sat motionless, his face pale beneath its professional composure, perspiration beginning to gather on his forehead despite the room's comfortable temperature. He had grasped the full implication of Miss Marple's seemingly innocent tale, that she had seen through his elaborate performance, recognizing the patterns that connected his carefully orchestrated crime to the timeless motivations of human greed and self-preservation. "Sometimes," Miss Marple concluded softly, gathering her knitting into her bag with deliberate care, "the most dangerous individuals are those who are trusted most completely, those who possess the knowledge and position to manipulate life and death, and then to conceal their actions behind facades of professional concern and community service." As she prepared to take her leave, Miss Marple offered one final observation that hung in the air like a verdict already rendered. "The widow's song has ended, Dr. Hawthorne, but I suspect its echoes will continue to resonate until the truth finds its proper voice." Dr. Hawthorne made no reply, but his silence spoke volumes. As Miss Marple's footsteps faded down the surgery corridor, he remained seated at his desk, staring at the foxgloves in his garden with the expression of a man who had just realized that his most carefully constructed performance had been seen through by someone whose gentle exterior concealed an understanding of human nature that no amount of professional training could match or deceive. The psychological game had been played with characteristic subtlety, and without a single direct accusation, the truth had been illuminated. The widow's song had indeed found its true conductor, and Miss Marple knew that the final movements of this carefully orchestrated deception were now approaching their inevitable crescendo. The late afternoon mist that had settled over St. Mary Mead seemed to press against the windows of Willowmere House's drawing room, where Inspector Craddock had assembled the principal figures in what he privately suspected would be the final act of this carefully orchestrated drama. The room itself, with its faded chintz and family portraits, provided an oddly domestic setting for what Miss Marple recognized as the inevitable confrontation between truth and the elaborate deceptions that had surrounded Mrs. Ashford's death. Richard Pemberton sat nervously by the fire, his hands betraying a persistent tremor as he adjusted and readjusted the coal scuttle with unnecessary attention. Mrs. Helena Fairfax maintained her elegant composure in the wing-backed chair, though Miss Marple noted the way her gloved fingers worked constantly at the fabric of her skirt, betraying an inner tension that her dignified exterior could not entirely conceal. Dr. Hawthorne occupied the chair nearest the door, his professional bearing intact but requiring visible effort to maintain, his medical bag clutched with the kind of defensive grip that spoke of a man preparing for siege. Inspector Craddock began with the methodical precision of someone who had spent the day arranging pieces of evidence into an unassailable pattern. "The laboratory reports have provided conclusive evidence about Mrs. Ashford's death," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of official determination. She died of digitalis poisoning, administered in a concentration that could only have been prepared by someone with sophisticated botanical knowledge and precise understanding of dosage calculations. Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their gentle rhythm as she observed the subtle reactions to this pronouncement. Richard's bewilderment appeared genuine, his pale face reflecting the confusion of someone still struggling to comprehend the reality of deliberate murder. Helena's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, though whether from fear or relief remained unclear. Dr. Hawthorne's professional mask remained firmly in place, yet Miss Marple detected the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested intense concentration on maintaining his composure. The most intriguing aspect of this investigation, Miss Marple interjected with characteristic gentleness, has been the elaborate nature of the misdirection employed by our murderer. The false trail to London, the use of Dr. Hawthorne's name at the Bloomsbury chemist, the carefully timed postal delivery, all designed not merely to conceal the crime, but to establish the perpetrator as an apparent victim of frame-up rather than the architect of murder. Her observation hung in the air like a question that demanded answering, and she continued with the patient persistence of someone unraveling a particularly complex knitting pattern. You see, the most sophisticated criminals often employ a strategy that appears to implicate themselves, knowing that the very obviousness of such evidence will lead investigators to dismiss it as clumsy attempt at frame-up. It provides the perfect alibi. Who would be foolish enough to use their own name when committing murder? Dr. Hawthorne's professional courtesy remained intact, though his voice carried a slight edge when he replied. Miss Marple, while your theories are creative, I fail to see how speculation about criminal psychology addresses the actual evidence in this case. Oh, but it addresses it most directly, Miss Marple replied with gentle persistence. Because the actual evidence tells us that Mrs. Ashford was not poisoned by any elaborate postal scheme, but by a single doctored throat lozenge placed precisely where she would be certain to consume it during her preparation for the performance. Someone who knew her habits intimately, someone who understood that she would never question a familiar comfort presented in recognizable packaging. Inspector Craddock produced a small evidence envelope containing the twisted scrap of waxed paper that had been found near the music box. This wrapper shows traces of the medicinal scent that persisted even after exposure to the garden's dampness. More significantly, it represents the only piece of physical evidence that was not part of the elaborate misdirection scheme. It was the actual delivery method for the fatal dose. Miss Marple nodded approvingly as the inspector continued his methodical presentation. The timing of the murder required someone who could predict Mrs. Ashford's behavior with medical precision, someone who understood that the emotional stress of her planned revelation would accelerate her heart rate and increase the absorption of the toxin, ensuring that the collapse would occur at the moment of maximum dramatic impact. The psychological pressure was building with inexorable force, and Miss Marple recognized the moment for her most crucial observation. Dr. Hawthorne, your note to Mrs. Ashford on Saturday morning, urging her to discuss matters before making any announcements, reveals that you were aware of her intentions to expose Colonel Ashford's bigamous marriage and, by extension, your systematic blackmail of Mrs. Fairfax to keep that secret buried. She paused, allowing the implication to settle before delivering her final, devastating analysis. Your professional position provided perfect camouflage for your activities, just as your medical knowledge gave you the means to commit an almost undetectable murder. The checking of your pocket watch before Mrs. Ashford's final verse, your confident navigation of the supposedly unfamiliar garden paths, your immediate assumption of medical authority when she collapsed. These were not the actions of an innocent bystander, but of someone orchestrating the very tragedy he pretended to treat. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of accumulated evidence and inexorable logic. Dr. Hawthorne's carefully maintained facade was cracking under the relentless pressure of Miss Marple's gentle but devastating analysis, his professional composure finally beginning to fracture after years of successful deception. "She was going to destroy everything," he said suddenly, his voice breaking with the desperate relief of someone who had carried the burden of elaborate lies too long. 20 years of careful work, reputation, financial security, all threatened by her need to expose ancient scandals that should have remained buried with the Colonel. The confession, once begun, poured forth with increasing desperation as Dr. Hawthorne described the intricate web of blackmail and manipulation he had constructed around the village's secrets. Mrs. Ashford had discovered not only Helena's delusional claims about her relationship with Colonel Ashford, but also his systematic exploitation of that knowledge for financial gain. Her planned performance in the empty garden was intended as a grand revelation that would expose both Helena's pathetic fantasies and his own profitable manipulation of them. "I couldn't allow that to happen," he continued, his professional authority completely abandoned. "The digitalis was simple enough to prepare. I had legitimate access to the raw materials, and the concentration required was well within my knowledge. The single lozenge, placed among her familiar preparations where she would be certain to find it, was timed to take effect during the emotional climax of her performance." As Inspector Craddock moved to make the formal arrest, Miss Marple reflected on the tragic irony that Mrs. Ashford's attempt to expose one form of deception had led directly to her death at the hands of someone whose own deceptions ran far deeper and more systematically than anyone had imagined. The widow's song had ended not in the revelation she had planned, but in murder orchestrated by the very person whose professional oath should have compelled him to preserve life rather than destroy it. The empty garden, which had served as the stage for Mrs. Ashford's final performance, would now be remembered not for its romantic associations with Colonel Ashford's past, but as the scene where a trusted physician had chosen personal preservation over professional ethics. The most dangerous criminals, as Miss Marple had long observed, were often those who appeared most helpful, most respectable, most eager to assist in solving the very crimes they had committed. The widow's song had found its true conclusion at last, though not in the harmony its intended performer had planned. Truth, like the persistent ivy that claimed the walls of forgotten gardens, had its own way of emerging through even the most carefully constructed facades, revealing at last the human nature that no amount of professional training or social respectability could ultimately conceal or transform. The days that followed Dr. Hawthorne's arrest brought to St. Mary Mead the peculiar atmosphere that settles over a community when a trusted pillar of respectability is revealed to have harbored the darkest of secrets. Miss Marple observed this phenomenon from her cottage window as she arranged the last chrysanthemums of the season, noting how conversations ceased abruptly when participants realized they were being observed, and how the usual rhythms of village life seemed disrupted by the collective need to reassess relationships and memories that had suddenly taken on sinister new meanings. Inspector Craddock's final visit carried with it the satisfaction of a complex case resolved, though his expression suggested that the resolution had raised as many troubling questions about human nature as it had answered about criminal method. The evidence against Dr. Hawthorne was overwhelming. His confession had been followed by the discovery of botanical extraction equipment in his surgery's back room, along with detailed notes about digitalis concentrations that revealed the systematic planning behind Mrs. Ashford's murder. 23 years he had been practicing in this area, Inspector Craddock mused as he accepted Miss Marple's offer of morning tea. The financial records we've uncovered suggest he was extracting substantial sums from at least 6 different families, all based on secrets he had discovered through his professional access to their private lives. Mrs. Fairfax's payments to keep her delusions about Colonel Ashford quiet, Richard's gambling debts, even Mrs. Price Ridley's daughter's unfortunate romantic entanglement. He had turned the entire village into a source of income. Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their gentle rhythm as she considered the implications of such sustained deception. The most dangerous predators are often those who wear the most respectable masks, she observed with characteristic understatement. Dr. Hawthorne understood that his medical degree and social position provided perfect camouflage for activities that would have aroused immediate suspicion in someone of lesser standing. The murder itself had been planned with the precision of someone who understood both human psychology and medical toxicology. The single poisoned lozenge, placed among Mrs. Ashford's familiar preparations where she would be certain to consume it, had been timed to take effect during the emotional climax of her planned revelation. Most cunningly, he had orchestrated an elaborate misdirection scheme designed to establish himself as a victim of frame-up rather than a perpetrator of murder. Richard Pemberton, freed from both his aunt's disapproval and the doctor's blackmail, found himself the reluctant master of Willowmere House. The young man had grown visibly in the days since the arrest, his nervous energy crystallizing into something approaching genuine responsibility. When Miss Marple called upon him, she found him in the empty garden, supervising two men with careful boots and blunt tools who were clearing the overgrown paths. "I thought Aunt Lydia would have approved," he confided, gesturing toward the emerging geometry of the restored garden. She always believed in supporting those who were trying to better themselves, rather than those who profited from others' misfortunes. "I've decided to establish a scholarship fund in her memory. The house will be sold, but this garden will be donated to the village as a memorial space." The fountain, once a brown bowl of leaves, was now merely a cracked basin with aspirations, but Richard spoke of having it properly restored. On the little table by the pavilion lay the music box, its glass dome returned, though its key had been removed. The inscription, when the sun touched it, shone very legibly, indeed. Helena Fairfax had departed St. Mary Mead the morning after Dr. Hawthorne's arrest, escorted by a cousin who was more practical than sympathetic. She left with her luggage properly strapped, and her pride like a fragile, heavy object no one wished to drop. The letters that had once seemed to promise legitimacy now read in the sober light of common day as the correspondence of a man who enjoyed romance while reserving for himself the flexibility of a soldier's conscience. Her years of delusion had been replaced by a different kind of clarity, the understanding that she had been systematically exploited by someone who had recognized her vulnerability and turned it to his advantage. As for Dr. Hawthorne, he experienced in a matter of hours the reverse alchemy by which esteem turns to judgment. The police found notebooks whose neat entries concealed payments that were not medical, a drawer of innocently labeled tinctures in which one bottle contained something neither innocent nor quite accounted for, and correspondence in careful, empathetic tones that, read now, had the chill of leverage. He said little during his remand proceedings, and when he did speak, it was in the language of a man who had lived by explanations and now found them suddenly perfumed with their own decay. The village's collective reaction evolved from stunned disbelief to a strange, almost morbid satisfaction. Mrs. Bantry, holding court at the post office, declared that she had always felt there was something a little too smooth about him, a sentiment echoed by many who now conveniently remembered their vague misgivings. The butcher swore he had never liked the doctor's handshake. The baker's wife confessed that she had, and that this now seemed to her a moral failing. In the chemist's window, Mr. Sykes had removed his display of patent throat lozenges, a gesture that was either practical or symbolic, depending on the observer. The surgery's blinds remained drawn, and a discreet notice announced that patients should consult the county clinic until further arrangements could be made. Miss Marple, reflecting on the complex human drama that had played out in the empty garden behind Willowmere House, offered Inspector Craddock one final observation. Mrs. Ashford intended her widow's song to be a revelation of old secrets, but instead it became the catalyst for exposing a much more dangerous and contemporary evil. Sometimes the truth emerges in ways we never anticipate, but it emerges nonetheless. As autumn deepened into winter, the village returned to its habits, though not precisely to its innocence. There were still darts at the Rose and Crown, still small disputes about lawns and larger ones about whether the new man at the garage overcharged for oil. But people looked a little longer at things that had seemed self-explanatory. At doctors' signatures, at parcels without return addresses, at the beauty of foxgloves, which was never lessened by the knowledge of their use. The empty garden itself bore witness to the village's capacity for renewal. Under Richard's careful stewardship, the geometric beds began to emerge from their wild tangle. The fountain was restored to working order, and the pavilion cleared of its concealing ivy. It would no longer be a place of forgotten secrets, but a space for quiet contemplation, a testament to the enduring power of nature to reclaim and renew. Miss Marple sat by her window with her knitting and watched the last of the chrysanthemums complete their sensible careers. She reflected on how evil so often presents as helpfulness, how vanity wears the robes of duty, and how a small, sticky twist of paper can be as decisive as any signed confession. She thought of gardens, how the prettiest are those where weeds are known by name and not mistaken for flowers, how a wall keeps out what it can, but not what grows from beneath. The widow's song no longer played in the empty garden, but it lingered where songs always do when they have done their work, in the altered attention of those who heard them. The village, which would continue to be ordinary in thousands of ways, had been reminded that ordinary things contain everything: love, error, theft, kindness, poison, and the redeeming comfort of a cup of tea poured at the right moment by a hand that has noticed more than it has said. Miss Marple, content that this was as much order as any garden ever requires, counted her stitches and, as the daylight faded, did not drop a single one. The widow's song had ended at last, not in the harmony its intended performer had planned, but in the harsh discord of truth finally confronting the elaborate deceptions that had flourished in the shadows of respectability. In her experience, such revelations, however painful, ultimately strengthened communities by removing the cancerous influences that had fed on secrecy and shame. The empty garden would bloom again, and St. Mary Mead would continue its quiet existence, perhaps a little wiser about the dangers that could lurk behind the most trusted and familiar faces. Human nature, Miss Marple knew, followed remarkably consistent patterns, but with careful observation and a deep understanding of its familiar pathways, even the most cunningly hidden secrets could eventually be brought to light. The winter that settled over St. Mary Mead carried with it the peculiar quality of aftermath, when a community must slowly absorb the shock of revelation and begin the delicate process of rebuilding trust in the familiar patterns of daily life. Miss Marple observed this healing from her cottage window as she worked on an intricate Fair Isle pattern, noting how conversations had gradually resumed their normal cadences, though with a new undercurrent of caution that spoke to hard-won wisdom about the masks that respectability could wear. The trial of Dr. Geoffrey Hawthorne proceeded through the grey months of winter with the methodical efficiency that characterizes British justice when confronted with overwhelming evidence and a defendant whose elaborate deceptions had finally collapsed under their own weight. Inspector Craddock visited Miss Marple one February morning, his breath visible in the cold air, to share the final resolution of a case that had transformed from apparent natural death to systematic criminal enterprise through the patient application of observation and logic. 25 years for murder, with additional sentences for blackmail, fraud, and professional misconduct, Inspector Craddock reported as he settled into the familiar chintz chair, gratefully accepting the offer of hot tea. The judge described it as one of the most systematic cases of professional abuse he had encountered in 30 years on the bench. The medical board has naturally struck him from their register, though that seems rather academic given the circumstances. The investigation had revealed the stunning scope of Dr. Hawthorne's criminal enterprise, extending far beyond the boundaries of St. Mary Mead. His method had been consistent across 3 different practices: establish himself as a pillar of respectability, gain access to private information through his professional position, then exploit that knowledge for financial gain while maintaining his reputation as a caring physician. The notebooks found in his surgery contained precise dilution tables for various toxins, correspondence revealing systematic blackmail of at least 15 families, and detailed psychological profiles of his victims' vulnerabilities. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused in their gentle rhythm as she considered the human cost of such prolonged deception. 23 years of practice in this area, she mused quietly. How many lives he must have touched, how many confidences he exploited. The true tragedy is not merely Mrs. Ashford's death, but the systematic betrayal of trust that preceded it. In my experience, the most dangerous predators are often those who wear the most respectable masks. Richard Pemberton had emerged from the ordeal with unexpected maturity. His nervous energy transformed into purposeful activity that surprised even those who had known him since childhood. The sale of Willowmere House proceeded smoothly, with the substantial proceeds establishing both the scholarship fund in his aunt's memory and a significant donation to the county hospital for enhanced training in medical ethics. Under his careful stewardship, the empty garden underwent a complete transformation, its geometric beds cleared and replanted with flowers chosen to represent hope rather than memory. He visits regularly, Mrs. Bantry confided during one of her afternoon calls, her voice carrying genuine admiration for the young man's dedication. Tends the roses himself and sees that the fountain runs properly, says it helps him remember his aunt as she truly was, rather than as she appeared in those final, terrible moments. The music box remains in the pavilion, though he's had the inscription polished away. Some memories, he believes, are better left to fade naturally. Helena Fairfax had not returned to St. Mary Mead, though letters from her cousin indicated that she was slowly recovering her equilibriums in the quieter environment of a seaside town. The revelation that her decades-long obsession with Colonel Ashford had been systematically exploited by Dr. Hawthorne had initially devastated her, but ultimately provided a strange kind of liberation. For the first time in 20 years, she was free from both her delusions and the financial burden of maintaining them, learning to wear ordinary cotton gloves when gardening, and to leave off the white kid leather that had once concealed her shame. The village itself had adapted to the absence of its former physician with characteristic resilience, embracing Dr. Margaret Thornfield with an enthusiasm that spoke to their collective relief at encountering genuine professional integrity. The young woman, recently qualified from Edinburgh, had taken over the practice with straightforward competence that seemed almost revolutionary after years of Dr. Hawthorne's manipulative charm. Her approach to medicine was refreshingly direct. She treated ailments rather than exploiting vulnerabilities, and her patients found themselves oddly comforted by her clear professional boundaries and lack of excessive sympathy. The broader implications of the case had resonated throughout the medical establishment, leading to enhanced protocols for monitoring physicians who moved frequently between practices and improved oversight of medical professionals who demonstrated unusual interest in their patients' financial affairs. The medical board, initially reluctant to acknowledge that one of their own could have so systematically abused his position, ultimately embraced comprehensive reforms designed to prevent similar betrayals of professional trust. As spring approached and the first daffodils appeared in what was now simply called Willowmere Gardens, Miss Marple reflected on the curious way that truth, like the persistent bulbs that push through winter soil, eventually found its way to light, despite the most determined efforts to keep it buried. Mrs. Ashford's intended revelation had been silenced by murder, but the investigation that followed had exposed far more extensive corruption than her planned announcement could ever have achieved. The memorial garden bloomed with particular beauty that spring, its restored fountain singing with clear water, and its pavilion providing shelter for village children who played among the roses without knowing the dark history that had once shadowed those walls. The music box remained in its place of honor, its melody now a celebration of renewal, rather than a lament for death, while a simple brass plaque nearby bore only the words, "In memory of those who seek truth, and in hope of those who find it." Miss Marple, observing these transformations from her cottage window, found deep satisfaction in the knowledge that even the most carefully constructed deceptions eventually yielded to persistent observation and unwavering commitment to justice. The patterns of human behavior might be depressingly consistent, but so too was the capacity for communities to heal, for individuals to grow beyond their limitations, and for truth to emerge from the most unlikely circumstances. The widow's song, which was to have been a simple exposure of romantic deception and social pretense, had ultimately become the catalyst for revealing a criminal enterprise that had poisoned the very foundations of medical practice in the area. Sometimes, Miss Marple mused as she completed the final stitches of her Fair Isle pattern, Providence worked through the most unexpected channels, turning intended harm into ultimate good through the patient application of justice and the irrepressible human capacity for renewal. Dr. Hawthorne's elaborate performance had finally ended, not in the triumph he had orchestrated, but in the exposure of every carefully hidden crime. His understanding that respectability could serve as the most effective cloak for depravity had ultimately been his undoing, for it was precisely his excessive charm and helpful demeanor that had first aroused Miss Marple's suspicions. In her long experience of human nature, she had learned that those who appeared most eager to assist in solving crimes were often the very ones who had committed them. As the village settled into its renewed rhythms, perhaps a little wiser about the dangers that could lurk behind the most trusted faces, Miss Marple reflected that both knitting and detection required the same essential skills: patience, attention to detail, and the ability to recognize when individual threads, however carefully arranged, created patterns that revealed their true nature only when viewed from the proper perspective. The empty garden was empty no longer, filled instead with the laughter of children and the quiet satisfaction of a community that had learned to look more carefully at the familiar faces around them. The widow's song had ended at last, not in the bitter revelation Mrs. Ashford had planned, but in the sweet restoration of trust and the quiet renewal of a village that had discovered the difference between genuine care and manipulative exploitation. Truth, like the persistent ivy that claimed old walls, had its own way of emerging through even the most carefully constructed facades, revealing at last the human nature that no amount of professional training or social respectability could ultimately conceal or transform. Miss Marple, content that this was as much order as any garden ever required, counted her stitches in the gathering dusk and, as had become her habit, did not drop a single one. The patterns of human nature would continue to repeat themselves, but with careful observation and deep understanding of their familiar pathways, even the most cunningly hidden secrets could eventually be brought to light. The widow's song was finished, but the eternal symphony of human nature, in all its complexity and contradiction, played on. The golden light of early summer seemed intent on blessing St. Mary Mead with the kind of forgiveness that only time and justice properly served can bring. Miss Marple made her way slowly up the familiar path to Willowmere Gardens, her walking stick tapping against the newly laid flagstones that Richard Pemberton had installed to ensure the memorial space remained accessible to all who wished to visit. The transformation was complete now, the wild tangle of secrets and neglect replaced by carefully planned beds that bloomed in gentle succession throughout the seasons. The first anniversary memorial service drew nearly the entire village to the restored pavilion where Mrs. Ashford had intended to perform her final, tragic revelation. Richard Pemberton, transformed by responsibility from a nervous young man into someone approaching genuine dignity, stood beside the brass plaque he had commissioned with words that captured his aunt's true legacy. In memory of Lydia Ashford, whose garden is our garden. The music box sat in its place of honor beneath the glass dome, its mother-of-pearl surface now unburdened of romantic inscriptions, its melody ready to play once more as celebration rather than lament. Dr. Margaret Thornfield's presence at the ceremony represented everything her predecessor had pretended to be. Genuinely caring, professionally competent, and scrupulously ethical in her treatment of patients' confidences. The villagers had embraced her straightforward competence with relief that bordered on gratitude, finding comfort in medical care that treated ailments rather than exploiting vulnerabilities. Her basket of foxglove seedlings, which she maintained at her surgery as educational specimens rather than garden ornaments, served as a practical reminder that knowledge could heal as easily as it could harm. Inspector Craddock's final report had revealed the staggering scope of Dr. Hawthorne's criminal enterprise. 17 additional charges filed, systematic blackmail operations spanning 3 counties, and detailed psychological profiles of victims whose trust had been systematically exploited for financial gain. The investigation had led to comprehensive reforms in medical oversight, enhanced protocols for monitoring physicians who moved frequently between practices, and improved training in professional ethics that would protect future patients from similar predators. As the memorial service concluded with the music box's gentle melody floating across the restored garden, Miss Marple reflected on the curious mathematics of justice that had emerged from Mrs. Ashford's death. One woman's intended revelation of romantic deception had ultimately exposed a far more dangerous and systematic evil, leading to reforms that would protect countless future victims. The widow's song, silenced by murder, had found its voice in the scholarship fund that would support students pursuing medical ethics, ensuring that future physicians understood the sacred trust they held in their hands. A small envelope arrived with the Morning Post brought news that provided its own form of closure. Helena Fairfax, writing from her seaside retreat, had enclosed a narrow brass ring, once part of the music box's stand in Colonel Ashford's study, polished to brightness by years of careful, unhappy attention. "I believe this belongs where it can do no more harm," her note read with the clarity of someone who had finally learned to distinguish between romantic fantasy and peaceful reality. Miss Marple placed the ring on the pavilion table, and Richard, understanding without explanation, set the music box upon it with the quiet satisfaction of completing a pattern so it could finally be set aside. The village children, who had initially been frightened by the dark history associated with the empty garden, now played freely among the roses and fountain, their laughter providing the most appropriate memorial to Mrs. Ashford's legacy. The space that had once harbored secrets and witnessed murder had been transformed into a place of genuine beauty and community gathering, demonstrating the remarkable human capacity for renewal that Miss Marple had observed countless times in her long experience of human nature. As evening approached and the memorial gathering dispersed, Miss Marple made her way home through lanes that had learned to behave themselves, reflecting on the enduring patterns of human nature that repeated themselves across generations. The same vanities, the same weaknesses, the same capacity for both systematic evil and patient justice that had characterized her species for millennia. Dr. Hawthorne had understood that respectability could serve as the most effective cloak for depravity, but he had ultimately underestimated the power of careful observation and unwavering commitment to truth. The widow's song had ended not in the bitter revelation Mrs. Ashford had planned, but in the sweet restoration of trust and the quiet triumph of justice over even the most elaborate deceptions. The empty garden bloomed in perpetual renewal, filled now with the voices of children, the conversations of villagers, and the eternal music of water flowing over carefully chosen stones. Miss Marple settled into her familiar chair by the window, her knitting needles resuming their gentle rhythm, confident that whatever mysteries tomorrow might bring, they too would yield to patient observation and the understanding that light, after all, was simply attention properly paid. The patterns would repeat themselves as they always did, but with careful watching and deep understanding of human nature's familiar pathways, even the most cunningly hidden secrets could eventually be brought to light. The widow's song was finished, but the eternal symphony of human nature, in all its contradiction and possibility, played on through the gathering dusk, as it always had and always would.